Many years ago, when I was a teenager, I worked at Jack's grocery store in Harlem, delivering groceries and doing little chores around the store. One of my chores was to keep the cooler filled with beer and soda. This was one of those old-fashioned coolers, a sort of square vat where you set the bottles and put in little chunks of ice. As the ice melted, you had a pool of cold water that chilled the drinks. Before I first filled the cooler, Jack explained certain things. Although he wanted the cooler kept full, he warned me against trying to force too many bottles together. When you did that with a beer bottle, it could explode in your hand. The glass was thin during World War II. "Do you understand?" he asked. "Yes." What did he think I was, a dummy? Before very long, I was busy filling up the cooler and forcing bottles together. Suddenly, there was a loud noise, and I found myself holding the jagged neck of a beer bottle while the beer and fragments of glass were spread all over the cooler. It was a mess. We had to empty the whole cooler and drain it, and we couldn't leave pieces of broken glass in there for customers to cut their hands on, so all those little pieces had to be carefully picked out one by one. Jack seemed to take a couple of deep breaths before saying anything to me, as if he were trying to control himself. He seemed terribly irritable to me. Anybody could make a mistake. Some days later, I was again filling up the cooler. Jack made some remark that I thought was sarcastic, so I just ignored it. Everything was going fine until the cooler was just about full. Then suddenly there was a loud noise. I found myself holding the top half of a beer bottle while the bottom half was all over the cooler. It was startling. Who would have thought something like that could happen? I was amazed. Jack seemed dumbfounded, too. I told Jack I was never going to do that again, but never isn't all that long when you're a teenager. Exploding beer bottles became a way of life at Jack's grocery store. Each time it caught me completely by surprise. Some of the customers thought it was funny. Jack never did. He threatened to fire me. I thought that was very harsh. Decades later, I wondered how Jack found the patience to put up with me. If our roles had been reversed, I would have probably thrown him out on his ear. Not all my employers were as patient as Jack. Only so often could you keep forgetting what they told you and still have a job. They even got mad when you came in late. Losing a job was rough, especially after I left home and was on my own at 17. Back in those days, hunger was my problem, not the government's problem. I still thought it was a pain to have to get up early and keep watching the clock in order to get to work on time. But between punctuality and hunger, I quickly discovered that I preferred punctuality. In fact, I learned a lot of things much faster than I did at Jack's grocery store. What is the moral of the story? That nobody should be a teenager? There is probably something to be said for that. But since science has not yet found a cure for adolescence, the best we can do is give the only real antidote for immaturity, experience. When I was a teenager, jobs were a lot easier to come by. Black teenage unemployment today is several times higher than it was then. One of the reasons employers could afford to hire me was that my pay was very low, about what I was worth. The minimum wage law was not effective then. It wasn't changed for a dozen years after being enacted, so inflation had rendered it meaningless. Many low-wage industries were not even covered by the law. Then came humanitarian politics, the politics of compassion, as they now call it. No one could bear to see young people exploited by employers. The minimum wage was raised repeatedly, and its coverage spread into almost every nook and cranny of the economy. You don't see exploited teenagers in the ghetto anymore. Instead, they are standing around on street corners, often getting into trouble. Humanitarians feel a lot better.